I now welcome Miss Diab, Mr. Schneider and Mr. Starling to give evidence today, and I hope I got Diab right.
100%.
Good work, thank you. For the Hansard record, would you please state the name and capacity in which you appear before the committee, and we'll start with you, Mr. Starling.
Thank you, Chair. I am Randall Starling and I'm here as an individual. I would like to disclose that I am a member of the Liberal Party and a candidate for the Legislative Council for next year's March election, but I'm here as my own capacity, not as the Liberal Party.
Thank you very much.
My name is Jasmine Diab. I'm the President of Women in Nuclear Australia. I'm also the Managing Director of Global Nuclear Security Partners.
Thank you.
Mark Schneider, I'm representing myself.
Thank you. And we've already had yours, Mr. Starling, but before I invite you to make a brief opening... this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. To give me a false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement and then we proceed to discussions, would you please state if you're a current or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries? And thank you for yours already, Mr. Starling.
I am not a member of a political party or a union, and I have no investments besides in shoes.
Excellent. That's good. Nice shoes as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Schneider.
Yeah, I am not a member of a political party, an investor, or have any interests other than myself.
Thank you. I now invite you to all make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussions, and we'll start with you, Mr. Starling.
Thank you, Chair. It is quite clear to me WA has two choices when it comes to its energy system. The first choice is the current path, where we can head down a path where, like South Australia, where we're heavily reliant on renewables, with possible pumped hydro in Collie and the early closure of coal-fired power stations as seen in South Australia and as seen here in future if we keep going down this current path. Or the second option is to have affordable and reliable power through a mixture of coal for the medium and short term, with the nuclear in the long term, and the grid dominantly ran by gas for peaking power. So my aim here today is to use South Australia as a warning for Western Australia on not what to do, So, because I want affordable, reliable power. WA is an island within an island when it comes to energy. We are the only ones responsible for our destiny. Therefore, if it goes wrong, we cannot blame anyone else, because unlike South Australia, we do not have black coal connected via Victoria to turn on when the wind isn't shining and when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. As a young person, I'm very concerned about WA's energy future. Coming from Geraldton, where we do have frequent blackouts because of lack of infrastructure and supply, we know the cost of not having affordable, reliable energy. A urea project, a $3 billion urea project, was planned for Geraldton, but was moved to Three Springs because there was not enough energy capacity in Geraldton at that time. So there goes $3 billion from my local community. And that's what I'm here for today, to fight for a reliable and affordable energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Starling. Mr. Yap.
Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to be able to present to you. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of Noongar Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and more importantly emerging. My name is Jazz. First and foremost, I'm a mum, but secondly, I'm a STEM nerd. In my first career, I served for 22 years in the military, predominantly specialising in nuclear engineering and security as a combat engineer. I left the Army and became a Managing Director of Global Nuclear Security Partners, which has me working in the nuclear community across the globe. I am a Technical Advisor to Nuclear for Australia, an Executive on the Women in Nuclear Global Board, and the current President of Women in Nuclear Australia. Women in Nuclear Australia is a not-for-profit, apolitical organisation of professionals that work in all facets of the nuclear and radiological industries. We want to work in an inclusive and diverse environment. We currently have over 450 members across every state in Australia, specialising in things from science, engineering, nuclear medicine, through to policy, law and other specialities in the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies. One of our pillars is to engage in discussions around nuclear and radiation, using facts and evidence to ensure more Australians are informed on the raft of nuclear and radiological matters that affect us every day, because a lot of Australians just aren't aware of what we do. In our submission, we highlighted facts surrounding all the issues the Select Committee was interested in. I wanted to emphasise two of the facts to you all today. Firstly is energy density. This little replica uranium pellet, my little show and tell, has the equivalent energy output as 1 tonne of coal, 450 litres of crude oil, approximately 100 wind turbines, or around 1,000 solar panels. Why does this matter? This matters because the energy density of uranium means that for energy output that we need, you don't need as much land mass to produce that electricity, preserving more land for housing, agriculture, industry, and most importantly, conserving our unique Australian flora and fauna, which we are responsible to protect. My second fact is around energy security. Australia is abundant in resources, including rare earth minerals and fuels for the future like uranium. Due to prohibitive costs to business, we do not refine or process a lot of these materials domestically. Australia could embark on a full nuclear fuel cycle domestically, allowing us to have complete sovereign capabilities for enduring energy security. Less fuel fabrication, Australia already has expertise and experience in the entire nuclear fuel cycle. We mine uranium. Current policies limit this unnecessarily. However, we have the resources to mine and mill our own uranium for fuel. Nuclear startups in the enrichment space, for example Silex Technologies, have the expertise to enrich uranium, yet have had to move offshore because of prohibitions to our legislation. As I said, we don't have fuel fabrication experience, but this could be developed domestically. Operationally, we have operated research reactors in Australia safely and securely for over 70 years. We currently recycle our used fuel with support from France, and we have the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency established to build a national radioactive waste facility. Here in WA, we're pretty lucky. We already have 2 low-level waste facilities, a state-run and owned facility at Mount Walton, and a private entity just down the road in Sandy Ridge through Telus Holdings. Australia can do this and should do this so that we don't rely on other countries to produce what we need to have reliable and secure energy now and into the long-term future. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Chair, can I just ask for one point, just for the sake of Hansard, because you gave some interesting comparisons there and you used the prop. For the sake of Hansard, because we'll be reading back on this, maybe you can explain how big that is.
So
as opposed to saying, this here,
yeah.
these two.
So this is approximately the size of half a gummy bear, I say. Okay. Gummy bear is a size everybody knows.
It's about 10 mil by 10 mil. Square, yeah.
That's too scientific for me as a nuclear engineer.
Yeah, that's good. All right, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yap. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Chairman, Deputy Chairman, members of Parliament. First up, I want to say that nuclear fission is natural. The first operating nuclear reactor was in Gabon, Africa, and predates humanity. It operated on 100,000-year cycles over several million years, well before humanity was established. Give you a little background on who I am. I'm from the United States originally. I spent 23 years in the U.S. nuclear industry, 20 years in the Navy, operating 4 submarine reactors, 2 aircraft carrier reactors, and when I retired from the Navy, I went and worked for Dominion Energy, operating the 2 units at Surrey Power Station. In my lifetime, I have received 10 millisieverts of radiation that has been measured from commercial nuclear power. If I compare that to my sources of radiation, it is not even in my top 3. My number 1 is that nuclear reactor that appears at sunrise and ends at sunset, the sun. My number 2 is the planet itself, the food we eat, the water we drink, the bricks that make our homes. My number 3 is from medical technologies, x-rays, radiography, all those things. In fact, my largest acute dose, meaning short dose, was from x-rays taken at the dentist. It beat out a 12-hour shift of doing multiple jumps in high radiation areas at a nuclear facility at Surrey Power Station. One thing about Australia is you're getting nuclear submarines. There's no nation on this planet with nuclear submarines that does not have a robust commercial nuclear industry. I've heard comments about nuclear not being able to ramp. I worked at Surrey Power Station. Yes, we kept our reactors at 100% power most of the time. If you go back to the historic data from the 1970s and 1980s, Surrey Power Station was used to ramp based on the demand of the grid. It was elected by the power industries of the United States to make nuclear baseload because the number one cost of nuclear energy is people. It is 80% of the cost to operate a nuclear reactor in the United States. Compare that to natural gas and coal, where 80% is the cost of fuel. Your biggest cost savings in power to the grid would be to reduce your fuel consumption of your fossil plants and keep your nuclear as baseload. That is why nuclear is not ramped in the U.S. You could ramp your facilities. The units of power, the turbines at Surrey Power Station can ramp from 100% power down to 5% power in 90 minutes and ramp back up in 90 minutes. That's 1,600 megawatts of power that can be ramped within 90 minutes. That can support load following of renewables. I hear a lot of discussions about nuclear waste. I know this is not specifically focused on AUKUS, but each of the reactors that are on those submarines, the nuclear waste, the high-level waste has to be stored, would fit in the rubbish bin that is at everyone's curb, one of those. 8 submarines, 8 rubbish bins. I have spent hours and hours doing testing at diesels out of the ISFISI, which is the fuel storage area at the commercial site at Surrey Power Station. I have received 0 measurable radiation from that spent fuel, testing the diesel to make sure that the lights turn on in a loss of power. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll start off with Mr. Chester.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all witnesses. Particularly, can I acknowledge the service of you, Ms Diab, and Mr Schneider in your respective militaries, and thank you for your service to your respective countries. Ms Diab, my question to you, you had a degree in nuclear physics and chemistry. You went on to do a master's in nuclear engineering through UNSW because you're going to answer this question, apparently. Is there something Australia knows about nuclear energy that the rest of the world doesn't? Now, I assume you didn't get a complete answer to that question. I might ask you that one later on. But are you concerned at all that the current bans in Australia hinder our opportunity to fully engage in future opportunities in the global nuclear supply chain, particularly perhaps for young women and girls who may be interested in STEM like yourself?
Yeah, definitely. The current legislative bans suggest that nuclear is bad. And it suggests that there is something wrong with nuclear technology, which is a really odd thing for us to do, considering we run one of the most reliable research reactors in the world that produces neutrons every day for medicine and research. And we know that that's not bad. And we've just put in the plan to purchase nuclear-propelled submarines. So we know the technology in a submarine isn't bad. So why have we banned power generation? And so because of that ban, it's really hard to get young girls and women interested in nuclear careers because they're like, well, something's wrong with the technology. If it's illegal, what is wrong with it? And so I think something we really try to push with women in nuclear is that if we can lift the ban, it's no longer seen as a bad thing. It opens up so many possibilities for us to engage with more people on the current nuclear things we do every day without hiding in the shadows. For a long time, I didn't tell people I studied nuclear physics and nuclear engineering because people would look at me like I would glow in the dark. And they weren't open to that conversation. And I actually really applaud the government and the coalition for the submarine plan because it's allowed me to come out of the shadows and say, hey, you know what? Nuclear science is awesome. Do you know that we're surrounded by it every day? Do you know that everything essentially is radioactive in some way, shape or form? And it's allowed us to lift that literacy, which I think is really important for us to do in Australia.
Now, Chair, I promised one question. Can I have one more?
You can have one.
One more. Sorry, Mr Schneider, just in relation, and very, very much building on Ms Diab's comments then, if we've got a scare campaign running, talking down nuclear, and from your experience in the military, how damaging would that be to try and recruit young people to serve in nuclear-propelled submarines in the future?
I can actually answer that directly. I grew up in Northwest Oregon. We shut down our only operating nuclear reactor in the 1990s. I went to decide to join the United States Navy as a nuclear power operator. I had 12 teachers in high school try to convince me and tell me I was making the biggest mistake in my life. Right? That negative campaign does hurt recruiting. The U.S. Nuclear Navy is the most understaffed part of the United States Navy. The Navy, they are the highest paid in the United States Navy. They get $100,000 bonuses, US dollars, that's 150,000 Australian, for re-enlisting for an additional 2 years for a total of an 8-year tour with $40,000 sign-on bonuses. So that absolutely does hurt recruiting of the top talent in the United States.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Molino.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks, Ms. Diab and Mr. Schneider, for your service. As Mr. Chester said, look, I just had a question for each of you on waste. In Australia, we've struggled for decades to figure out what to do with the waste from our Lucas Heights reactor, and that's relatively small amounts of waste and relatively low grade. If we were to put in place large-scale power generating reactors, we would have much more waste and much higher grade. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on, you know, given the challenge, the unresolved challenge we have with such a small amount of waste, how do you see the risk of cost and delays and challenge around social license of this much larger challenge?
So I might pick you up on a couple of points here. The waste from a power reactor would be similar to the waste from the research reactor. You've got low enriched uranium fuels, so you'll end up with intermediate level waste and low level waste, which the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency is responsible for establishing that facility within Australia. Yes, they have to build social licence because this is an enduring capability that they will need to manage for a long time. The AUKUS submarine program, however, uses high enriched uranium fuels, which now introduce a high level waste that we now need to dispose of long term, which is different. World's best practice is deep geological repository for high level waste, which means we have to make long term decisions on where that is stored, how it's secured. The only way to do that is to have a bipartisan approach, because it is a decision that you can't backflip 4 years later if there's a change of government. It has to be a decision that Australians can trust, will endure decades, to be maintained and run safely and securely, so that we can continue being responsible for our own nuclear materials. I'm not sure if that answered the question fully, or whether you wanted to add some more.
Yeah, I do want to add something fully. So the U.S. Navy, when they defuel the reactors on submarines, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and everything that's nuclear powered for the United States Navy, that fuel is that spent fuel is shipped to Idaho, where it is stored. They meet all the regulatory requirements for each of the individual states. If you're going from Virginia to Idaho, that's like crossing 8 states to get there. So each state has to do that, so it's safely transported. Some of that fuel is actually transported back to our labs in the states to analyze. That's actually where the tritinuclides, which I forgot to bring with me, but which basically establishes a lot of the information about nuclear technology. For commercial reactors, Surrey Power Station and every commercial reactor in the United States stores their waste on site. It is stored safely. It's stored in containers. I have spent hours and hours, as I mentioned, hours and hours out by it, operating the security diesel that's out there. It's literally just for lights, right? It's just there to make sure we have lights and the cameras are still operating. Trojan Power Station, which was shut down in the 90s, has been completely cleaned up. All that remains is the switchyard and a barbed wire fence surrounding the spent nuclear fuel. It's going to sit there until the U.S. establishes a national repository. Those containers are rated for 300 years. You can smash those containers into brick walls traveling at 100 kilometers an hour and have no damage to them. There are tests that prove it. You can Google YouTube to find it. They're actually kind of fun to watch.
No, thanks. That's all useful. But just to clarify, in terms of the US, which has been operating power plants for a long time, so what's happening in the US is that the waste is stored on site until a national repository is finalised?
That is correct. We did have a national repository, but the United States government violated the contract and stopped that, and is now paying penalties to all the power companies in the U.S. to store their waste on site.
Thank you, Dr. Molino. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for appearing today. Thank you for your service, both Ms. Diab and Mr. Schneider, and best of luck to Mr. Starling on your desire to serve, albeit in a very different capacity. Ms. Diab, thank you for acknowledging up front that you are first and foremost a mum and a STEM nerd. Mums are the best, and we
So
need more.
nerds.
We need and we need more STEM nerds. So let me sort of draw on your STEM nerdiness in the questions I might ask. One of the suggestions made by some government members of this committee, as well as a couple of witnesses, has been that we may struggle to host nuclear power stations in Australia because of water access. And as you no doubt know, that the coalition's identified 7 locations, all of which are former or existing coal plant sites. Based on your experience in this field, I'm wondering whether or not you have any views with respect to water accessibility and risks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there's been this misconception when I talk to people about nuclear power plants that they consume water, which I'm not sure where that narrative has come from, but nuclear power plants, much like coal-fired power plants, circulate water to spin a steam turbine to generate electricity. So water is in a loop that circulates in and then goes back to that water source. There's that part with current water reactors. That's how they work. There's also a lot of other types of reactors that don't use water for cooling, because there are a lot of countries that don't have access to water and need to still keep their reactors cool. So there's dry cooling, much like a car engine, air cooling circulating through a reactor to allow it to remain cool. There's also gas-cooled reactors that use carbon dioxide or helium as a form of cooling within the reactor, or there's sodium or molten salts that can also be used to cool. So whilst people are concerned about water, I think we need to dispel the myth that there's water consumption from a reactor, that it is about using water to produce steam, to produce electricity, much like coal, but that there are other technologies that can be used to cool a reactor which don't rely on water. And I think that if water is an issue wherever we place nuclear power plants, we could consider technologies that don't use water cooling.
Well,
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please, Mr. Schneider.
Yeah, we have to distinguish what type of water we're talking about. We're talking about the pure water you're going to be using in your steam plant and in the primary plant of a pressurized water reactor, right? That is a very small amount. Aircraft carrier has 4 distilling units that each generate about 400,000 liters per day, right? On a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, the #1 consumer of water are the planes, followed by the crew, then the power plant itself, right? In fact, so the source of water for cooling the reactor is the ocean, right? That water goes in as salt water, goes through a condenser, it's completely separated from the fresh water, and then it ejects it out there as slightly warmer water. Same thing happens in 99% of the reactors on the planet. I'm not sure about some of the Russian and Chinese reactors, right? That happens in a coal plant, right? Coal plants take some sort of water body, whether it's the ocean, a lake, a river, treated sewage like in Phoenix, that the nuclear power plant out there uses treated sewage as its cooling medium, right? That water is not clean water. It's not processed for use for consumption. It's just whatever body of water is there.
Thank you. And another issue that has come up, on which I wouldn't mind getting some technical advice on, is the risk of nuclear power plants to human health. A witness this morning also talked about it, suggesting if you're too close to a rod, it poses a real health risk. And we've heard some pretty stark evidence from one person in particular about the amount of children who have leukemia and so forth. I'm wondering if you can give us some advice. I know you've already, Mr. Schneider, already expressed some of your own lived experience in terms of the safety, but comparing nuclear to other forms of energy production when it comes to issues of safety, including, but not only, human health. To either or both.
Yeah, so there's, you can go.
Okay. All right, so I will talk about the U.S.'s worst accident, Three Mile Island. Right, so Three Mile Island had a meltdown, destroyed the unit, and then exposed the public to radiation. Right, the amount that the public was exposed was less than that from a flight from Perth to basically anywhere Perth flies. Right, so that's the amount of risk of radiation that the public was exposed to. To kind of add some clarification to a nuclear fuel rod, an unshielded fuel rod is dangerous, but that's why in the United States we keep them under 20 feet of water, because waters provide shielding. About 30 centimeters of water reduces the radiation by 90% for every 30 centimeters, right? So 30 centimeters, 90%, 60 centimeters, 99%, 99.9, right, going up, right? So you can imagine how much shielding that is. So there is really not a risk to the public from that, specifically from, I say modern, meaning U.S. Western designed reactors, even in the case of a meltdown.
So I'll refer you to the Women in Nuclear Australia submission, page 6, which has a beautiful table from Our World in Data, which shows the safest and cleanest forms of energy graphically. And you can see from that, they've looked at the number of deaths per terawatt hour of electricity production across a whole heap of energy sources. So you can see that the coal industry and the oil industry by far are more dangerous to employees on a deaths per terawatt hour, with 24.6 deaths and 18.4 deaths respectively. And nuclear actually sits right next to solar with 0.03 deaths. And this includes deaths that are associated with Fukushima, which is 0 from radiation or nuclear, Chernobyl, which did have some deaths due to the first responders that had been exposed to the reactor core whilst it was open and in meltdown. And so you can see that actually, if you talk about risk and safety, we already have some of the highest risk energy forms industries in Australia, and we accept that quite readily. As Mark has mentioned, his exposure to radiation whilst working in a nuclear power plant is actually extremely low because there are so many risk mitigation measures put in place to protect workers, to protect the environment and to protect the community. And that's why nuclear is so heavily regulated, to ensure we're being responsible around radioactive material.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, something else the committee has heard evidence on is that nuclear power may not be considered clean because of inherent embodied emissions in nuclear. Can you please comment, if you have any knowledge or any data, on the relative emissions profiles of different technologies such as nuclear versus maybe wind and solar on embodied emissions? Do you have...
So I have one that's kind of an interesting fact. There's more concrete in Hoover Dam than there is in the entire U.S. nuclear industry. Right, so one dam that produces less power than one nuclear power station, or about as much as one nuclear power station in the U.S., has more concrete. Concrete emits CO2 in the process. When you start looking at the foundations of wind turbines and solar farms, right, there's actually quite a bit of emissions that comes from that. That's what they're talking about with the inherent. Nuclear has a very low profile. It's from the construction that occurs.
I'll refer you again to the Women in Nuclear submission, page 10. We have another graph from Our World in Data that talks to materials use per low carbon energy source. And on there, onshore and offshore wind, well, onshore wind has quite an extreme amount of resources that it uses, predominantly in concrete for the deep footings that they require. But wind and solar have a much higher footprint than nuclear, and you'll see on that graph they've got two nuclear examples. The EPR, so the French design reactor, it is a complex reactor, I would say, as a nuke eng. That would not be my favourite to build, but it also compares to AP1000, which is a much simpler design. And you can see that the footprint of materials used is a lot less, therefore you're producing a lot less carbon in those materials in the construction. And it does have battery storage in there, which looks at the rare earth minerals, but batteries don't produce electricity and they don't produce heat. So whilst it's included in there, I'd put a little caveat that that's not an energy producer.
Thank you. Another thing that's come up frequently is spent fuel. I think Dr. Molino was talking about it. Can you compare, how they store, and Mr. Schneider, you were talking about it in depth earlier about spent fuel, but have you done any comparisons about waste from, I've heard estimates we may have to produce 22,000 solar panels a day, 40 wind turbines a month, and sort of battery storage. Have you done any comparisons on comparing nuclear storage versus comparing the waste from some of those?
So the entire nuclear waste profile of the United States would fit on a football pitch that's about 20 meters tall for 70 years of operation.
Wow. Okay, that's a great fact.
Final question.
Okay, yep. Oh, look, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Ms. Mascarenas.
Thanks for appearing today. My question is around uranium mining in Western Australia, and the Colin Barnett government lifted the basically bans against it, and that was back, I think, 2009, if I remember correctly. But we haven't seen this increase in the uranium mining industry in WA. Do you have some observations or comments in relation to that?
Yeah, so it's currently a policy that's in place that makes it cost prohibitive to export uranium from a West Australian port. They can't get a licence to do that, so we'd have to ship it to South Australia, which for the cost of uranium is just not worth it. And so that's why I think looking at some of the state-based bans and policies around uranium mining just make it so cost prohibitive for these mines. They just can't get the stuff out of the ground and make money off it, which is ultimately what they're set up to do.
Another question which is separate, which is to you, is around women in STEM professionals, and it's definitely something that I'm passionate about as well. And I think the thing that I saw in my career when I had the opportunity to work in decarbonisation, that vision really aligned with values. And what I see with female STEM professionals, they want to align values with creating that positive change. So from your perspective, do you think that just lifting the ban will see women come into the industry, or do you think that some of the risks from a, let's say, waste perspective would continue to be there irrespective of the legislative environment?
So we are getting a lot of young girls and women that are interested in nuclear. The thing is, we're losing them to overseas opportunities. There is a lot of investment from the international nuclear community and the IAEA in giving all these amazing skills to young women. And through Women in Nuclear Australia, we share those opportunities widely with high schools and universities. And we see these women go, this is amazing. They see that vision. They see nuclear because globally it's seen as a net zero power source. They see it as a really exciting career opportunity. They just don't see it in Australia. And I think it's that ban that makes them think that, well, Australia's never going to allow me to use those skills domestically, but I can go travel the world and work in France, work in Finland, work in Canada, work in the US. And like my fear is we will lose all this talent because there's so much of it out there, because we're just making it really difficult at the moment to see nuclear as a viable career unless you're in the Navy, which as an Army girl is not appetizing to me.
Navy beat Army
More skills.
Never stop.
And do you think that Western Australia should become a state that exports yellow cake?
We export so much, and I think why not include yellow cake? It's so abundant here in WA. We may as well be a part of that green fuel supply chain and make sure that there's fuel coming from a responsible country rather than some other countries that export uranium that may not have the highest safeguards and security standards. So I do think we should.
Would you mind if this isn't about uranium mining, it's actually about women in nuclear. So in the United States, if you hold a conference about nuclear energy, you're going to send a bunch of people that look like me and older to it. That's just how the nuclear energy industry is. But Women in Nuclear actually runs the show in the United States because they do these big conferences. It's your HR professionals, it's your legal. It's more than just a bunch of engineers and nerds, right? I mean, nerds are important, but we do need people that can actually talk to human beings, right? And
That's right. This lab's doing a fantastic job of that.
excited to discuss it.
She'll beat me up later. But in reality, women in nuclear is such a valuable aspect to the nuclear industry in the United States, and I'm very excited to see that Australia has a program that is robust as it is for as small of a nuclear footprint that there is here.
Did you want
Yes, I'd like to add that one of my recommendations is that actually that the government lifts the ban on uranium mining with immediate effect, because coming from the regions where job opportunities can be quite volatile, we need that diversification within as a port city, because we want the jobs, and also from a budget point of view as well. If we're relying so much on iron ore, gold and gas and lithium and nickel, I think uranium would just be another avenue for diversification for the WA economy.
Thank you, Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair. And before I start, I'll follow in similar suit to Mr. Chester, who was a former Veterans Affairs Minister. I sit as the one of the co-chairs of Parliamentary Friends of Veterans, so I would like to extend my thanks for both of your service to respective countries. I want to just touch on, I think it was Mr. Schneider, in your opening statement, or might have been in the line of questioning about ramping up and down of nuclear power stations, and the interoperability with a renewable grid such as West Australia, or for that matter on the East Coast. But if you are to ramp down the power station during daylight hours effectively, when you've got higher levels of solar power generation and or in high wind events where you're generating plenty of wind generated power, doesn't that by default then make nuclear energy more expensive to generate, because it's not operating at its peak capacity over the full 24-hour period, which is what the argument that I've been hearing is that's what makes nuclear energy cheaper, is because it can be switched up at 100% capacity all the time. That's what solar can't do, and when the wind stops blowing, that's what wind turbines can't do. So if you're saying that you can integrate it into a renewables grid and ramp it up and down, then doesn't it make it more expensive to generate nuclear power for consumers that either end consumer's going to pay for or government's going to have to subsidise?
So what is doing that without nuclear is my question to you before I answer that.
Sorry?
So right now, your
so when it doesn't blow, we have gas peaking, pumped hydro, etc., into the grid, and at the moment, currently, we have coal.
Yeah, so you're using another power plant, right? So you have to have another power plant. We're talking about getting to net zero overall, correct? I'm just clarifying.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I'm asking for clarification, these are going to be facilities that are built, they're going to be 1 year old, so their maximum cost is upon us, versus coal-fired power stations that are coming end of life. They have essentially paid for themselves. So there's a different discussion that needs to be had about the cost of power generation for a new power facility versus something that's pre-existing in the grid.
Yeah, so there will be some cost to that. Now, with wind and solar that's already existing, right, producing, for all intents and purposes, zero cost power, right? So you're as that's peaking out, and you have to have your nuclear to ramp up and down, you're actually extending your fuel, and your fuel is going to remain longer. Are you paying a little bit more for it up front? Yes. But overall, the lifespan of a nuclear reactor being, right now in the United States, they're talking about licensing to 120 years now. So, I mean, you're going to build a power plant that could last you for well over a century, right? This is an upfront investment. You're building a castle versus building in the United States a trailer park, right? So you're building a long-term thing that's going to last a long time. So yes, it's an upfront cost. It's very expensive. Housing in Western Australia is very expensive because of the style of housing that is built here with the brick and concrete compared to the United States with our stick built or our factory built homes that are cheap and get destroyed by tornadoes, right? the homes in Western Australia would survive most natural disasters in the United States. A nuclear power plant is going to survive for a century.
And I think the other part to that is you're paying almost a base level cost of that nuclear because it's going to be on anyway, even if it's only at 5% capacity because you've got solar and wind in abundance at that point of time. There is another option, though, that can allow us to get the most out of nuclear because running it at 100% is the most effective and efficient way, and pure engineer Jazz would say that's the most economic thing to do. But we already have so much renewables, we need to support them to keep the grid. So if you had nuclear running at 5%, supporting the grid, making sure it's stability, it's got its frequency control, then you can have the nuclear providing some energy to other forms, desalination. It could be providing energy direct to manufacturing and smelting, AI and data centres. That can be direct to power plant, which is what we're seeing a heap of rising in the US, where Amazon, Microsoft are connecting direct to a nuclear power plant, not being part of the grid. And so I think that there's a lot of optionality you can have with a nuclear power plant. We don't need to visualise it just as that base load.
So, and I respect that position, but wouldn't that then have the effect that you need to have direct transmission lines to these isolated facilities?
Which you wouldn't build too far away because that's not cost effective for those private companies that want to have that reliable direct connection to the grid anyway. So I think that that's...
So does...
yes, there'll be extra costs, but they're not going to be large.
Or is that paid for by government as a distribution cost?
The way the U.S. is doing that with those is that is Amazon or insert crypto mining company. They're the ones that are paying for that. They're paying for the connection with an understanding that if the grid needs the power, they're secondary. Right, so if the grid, if it's peak demand, they're going to shut off. That's standard level loading in the United States already. We do that with. I lived in Southeast Virginia. Nucor Steel's got a big factory in Northeast North Carolina. During the summer periods when air conditioning's at peak demand, they're not smelting. Right, so you can do with all sorts of industries. Right, you can use your industry to level load, and that would be no different. So when the sun is shining and you're producing your most, that's when you're definitely smelting, right? You're definitely doing that work. All your data centers are online, your crypto mining, all that stuff. And then as that power comes off the grid, you could then pull those off the grid to more level load your power. That's standard level loading. I'm sure Australia already does that.
Final question.
Thank you. Mr. Starling, so your submission makes a case for a private nuclear power industry, in particular in South Australia and Western Australia. But I note that the Liberal National Party policy is proposing a wholly government-owned and operated nuclear industry. So why do you think that is?
Because up north we have BHP, Rio Tinto, Jenna Reinhardt, etc., and if the ban on having nuclear reactors in Australia was lifted, due to the high cost that energy has on their mining operations and the isolation of those operations, I could see a scenario where, for example, Jenna Reinhardt will go, okay, I'm going to buy an SMR because A, it's cost effective, and B, you don't have to refill it. And so therefore, their costs go down. And because the problem with renewables is that...
Hang on. I asked you specifically why you think that the federal LNP are looking at government ownership.
Well, they're looking at government ownership only for coal. But to me, that is no excuse for stopping private proponents up north, like I've made in my report, to invest in nuclear energy for their energy source for their mining operations.
I don't think you answered the question, but anyway, we'll leave it at that.
Can I just do a follow-up?
Okay, yep, no worries. Mr.
Okay.
So your decision, Chair.
I'm going to let Ms. Mascarenas take my question, Deputy Chair. So
that's all right. I'll take Mr. Kennedy's one that he forewent to. So
Deputy
I'll
Chair,
wait.
we've all timed this out, right? So you can keep trying to push the boundaries if you
No,
like,
that's
or
right.
we can
You're
just
the
follow
chair.
on and let the witnesses do what they're doing.
You're the chair. You're in
Thank you,
charge.
Deputy
You're in
Chair.
charge.
One of the challenges in the mining industry is around mine life, and so typically mine lives are between 3 to 5 years, and so often what we see, that's how long a mine plan typically is. And so when you've got commercial projects that you're wanting to implement on site, often projects get pushed back because of payback periods. And so the thing that I don't have my head around in the scenario that you spoke about, having worked in the resource sector for over 16 years, is how you would actually get the approval internally for a power station that has a 40-year mine life when you're dealing with a 3 to 5 year mine plan.
Just so we're on the same page, can you please define internally in this context?
Oh, internally in a mining company. Because
Well, that's up to the mining company, and I'm sure there'll be proponents in there saying, look, we can save a lot of money on energy generation because they obviously want to minimise their costs, and one way to do that is to have a cleaner, more reliable, and a more dense energy source.
It's difficult to do that when you're in a 5-year mine.
Okay,
I'll stop there.
I don't agree with a 5-year mine life because Horizon, a railway company, built a railway line from Carrara, which is east of Geraldton, to the port of Geraldton because they had a mine life for 30 years. So I'm not sure where you're getting your 5-year mine life from, that's all.
Thank you.
I'll make that clear.
I'll just follow on with one question, because I'd like one question. It'd be nice if I could. And it's not about this. It's not actually about this. But anyway,
That's right. I've got one more too.
Deputy
anyway,
Chair,
so.
if you want to go on, right, we can go on. You had 7 minutes for your questioning.
I'll let you go one. I'll let you go one, Chair. It's all right.
Anyway, Miss Diab, just a question for you. You spoke around the water and saying about all the different options. Do you know what option that the opposition are going to use in the sites around Australia for water, for their cooling, for nuclear power?
No, because from what I understand, they're technology agnostic at the moment because they're going to let the nerds decide what's best for Australia, which is what it should be. Politicians shouldn't decide on technology, to be honest.
Okay.
It should be left to professionals that can understand the consequences of not just cooling, but the fuel type, the lifelong serviceability of that reactor. So from what I believe, the Coalition's plan is technology agnostic. It talks to size of reactor, not type of reactor.
That's really good to hear, because I think because I think that the experts need to make the decisions, obviously, on this. So how have they put a costing together on something that they don't know about then yet? Well, when they're technology agnostic, as everybody's saying.
Because I think you can take, everyone's demanding to understand a cost. And so I think you can take rough cost estimates on the types of reactors we're seeing in like countries. And that's how I believe.
Cooling? Like we're a country here that's extremely hot in some areas.
So they've taken the most popular reactor, being a light water reactor, because that is the most dominant globally. And you'd be silly to pick a type of reactor that's not the most dominant globally to do your modelling off, because what are the chances of you picking that technology? We don't know. We don't know.
Right, thank you. Unfortunately, we've came to the... if you're quick, you could add something. If you
Yeah, I was going to say, if we're doing this at coal sites, coal plants are steam engines that use a Carnot steam cycle, which is all the nuclear reactor is as well. The water consumption will probably be less because of higher maintenance standards required at nuclear power plants with less steam leaks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it